Bertrand Russell once said that until the second decade of this century, and remember that by that time he was in his 40s and had done virtually all the philosophical work for which he's really distinguished, he regarded language as transparent. That's to say, as a medium he could simply use without paying particular attention to it. Much the same must be true, I think, not only of other philosophers, but of writers of every kind, novelists, poets, and so on. It's only in this century that the enormous self-consciousness about language, which we now take for granted, has developed. In fact, it's become one of the most prominent intellectual characteristics of our age. What's involved isn't just a superficial interest in words, but beliefs about absolutely fundamental matters. For instance, it's come to be widely believed that it's more than anything else the particular power of abstract thinking made possible to us by language that enables us to conceptualize and cope with innumerable aspects of reality which are not present to us, and thus to relate ourselves to the world in the way we do. Many believe that it's this, more than anything else, that differentiates us from the animals. And for all these reasons, many believe that it's through the acquisition of a language that we become selves. If many of these things are true, then language is fundamental to our humanity and our individuality in ways that were not dreamt of till comparatively recently. And this, I think, is the underlying reason why philosophers of newly come to take such a powerful and indeed passionate interest in language. A philosopher of language who has made a reputation on both sides of the Atlantic is the American John Searle. He first studied philosophy at Oxford, where he arrived as a Rhodes Scholar in the early 1950s, and he taught at Oxford for some years before returning to the United States. His book, called Speech Acts, published in 1969, is something of a recent classic. He's now Professor of Philosophy at the University of California in Berkeley. Professor Searle, there's one thing which I think we must get straight right at the beginning. I've been talking about the philosophy of language, but there is another phrase, linguistic philosophy or linguistic analysis, which means something quite different. And this could be very confusing to our viewers unless we make the distinction clear at the outset.
Yes, well, it can be made very simply. Linguistic philosophy and linguistic analysis are names of techniques or methods for solving philosophical problems. The philosophy of language is not the name of a technique, but the name of a subject matter, branch of philosophy. I'll give you a couple of examples. The linguistic philosopher believes that you can solve certain traditional problems, such as problems about skepticism, by examining the ordinary use of words such as know. You examine the use of words...
No, K-N-O-W.
K-N-O-W.
Yes.
Verbs like know, believe, suppose, guess. Now, that would be a problem that the linguistic philosopher would work on. The philosophy of language is the name of a subject matter within philosophy, and there the problems are such things as how do words relate to reality? What is the nature of meaning? What is truth? Reference? Logical necessity? Those are problems in the subject matter of the philosophy of language.
Now, obviously, philosophers of language like yourself, regard language as being absolutely fundamental to human life and human thought and so on. I tried to explain just now in my introduction to this discussion some of the reasons why, but I think it would be especially interesting to hear from you as a professional in the field your reasons for regarding language as being as central as you clearly do regard it as being.
Well, I think, to begin with, it's almost bound to be central to philosophy. Philosophy is, in an important sense, a conceptual inquiry. But quite apart from philosophy, I think language is crucial, for some of the reasons you were suggesting, crucial to an understanding of human beings and human life. We tend, in a pre-theoretical way, to have the idea that words are, as you said, transparent, quoting Russell, and that we can just apply them. We just name our experiences and our social relations. But in fact, when we begin to investigate, what I think we find is that those forms of experience, those forms of social relation that we regard as characteristically human would be impossible without language. That language really is what distinguishes us more than anything else from other forms of animal life. I'll give you a couple of examples. Wittgenstein gave a very simple example to illustrate this about experience. It might seem obvious that our experiences just come to us independently of any language, but what Wittgenstein pointed out was a great many of our experiences would be impossible without language. And he gives this example. He draws a triangle, and he says, now see this as apex and that as base. And then he says, now see that as apex and that as base. And you'll find you have a different experience. I mean, it's just, I've named two different experiences that you can have. But the interesting thing is they're not experiences my dog can have. Not because he hasn't got the optical apparatus, but because he hasn't got the conceptual apparatus. The words, one wants to say, are part of the experience. Now, that's a trivial example, and one could give lots of more grand examples. I mean, let's take the following. La Rochefoucauld said, I forget where, that very few people would fall in love if they never read about it. And I think there is a real underlying truth in that, and that is that categories like love and hate themselves influence the experiences, that our concepts determine, or at least shape, our experiences, that it would be impossible to have the experiences that we have without the linguistic categories we have.
In other words, our experience of the world doesn't consist of the world as a lot of independent objects to which we as human beings then attach the labels of names, i.e. words. What you're saying is the objects don't exist separately from the words, that the words enter into the very structure of our experience.
Yes, now let me see if I can say what I think you're driving at. It would be this: not that language makes the world. That's the kind of subjectivism that I wouldn't want to accept, but rather something like this. What counts as an object, what counts as reality, is a function of the system of representation that we bring to bear on reality, namely language. So the world doesn't come to us all sliced up into objects and experiences. What counts as this object, or the same object, or as a book, or a table, or a glass, that is a matter of the categories that we impose on the world, and those are linguistic.
Would you say that this is true of say, an everyday object? Now, I'm holding here a glass of water, and I'm having the simple experience of seeing a glass of water. Now, for me to have the experience of seeing a glass of water, it's not enough for me simply to be having certain visual data. I've also got to have the concept glass and the concept water.
Precisely.
And I've got to be able to locate this experience as coming under that concept. And therefore I couldn't have the experience of seeing a glass of water without some linguistic equipment.
That's the point I'm making, precisely
yeah,
that.
Yeah.
And
therefore the language that we have helps to create the very categories in which we experience the world, the very categories in which we see objects, has language built into them. This is what you're saying.
It's precisely that.
Yes. Therefore, by investigations in the philosophy of language, we are investigating the very structure of experience.
Yes, yes.
And the structure of whole ways of life and ways of viewing the world and so on.
And indeed, that was one of Wittgenstein's great themes, was the idea that a language is a form of life, and that we should think of language as interpenetrating with our life, not as something that stands outside it and pictures it, as he once thought.
Now, another thing I said in my introduction to this was that this enormous self-consciousness about the use of language is something that characterizes this century. It's very striking that something very similar is true of the arts as well. For example, in this century, an enormous amount of poetry has been written about the writing of poetry, or about how difficult it is to be a poet. We have filmmakers making films about the making of a film. And it's true of plays, and painting has, so to speak, exhibited its own techniques. Even musical composition exhibits its own techniques. Art has become its own subject matter. The medium has itself become the object of attention. Now, there's an obvious parallel there with what has happened with language in philosophy. Do you think that these developments are all interconnected, or do you think it's sheer coincidence?
Well, it surely is not sheer coincidence. I mean, I think there are certain features of the 20th century mode of sensibility that makes language seem immensely problematic to us. But let me disagree with one thing you said. It isn't that philosophers have suddenly discovered language in the 20th century. There's a lot about language in Locke, devoted a whole book of the essay to it. There's a theory of language in Hume, and indeed back to Plato in the Theaetetus there are theories of language. So it isn't something we've recently discovered, but the point I think you're making, and I entirely agree with it, is that language has come to seem problematic. It has come to seem, to use your the quotation from Russell, not a matter of transparency. It isn't something that we can see right through to the world. It is itself a problem, and I think that has a great deal to do with something like the tremendous loss of confidence, the decline of rationality that occurred at the end of the 19th century. One doesn't know quite how to date the rise of modernism, but it is part of modernism in the arts, and surely it can't, as you say, it can't be just coincidental that the same awareness of the complexity and the problematic character of language exists in philosophy. Contrast Mill with the later Wittgenstein, and I think you see the break that I'm talking to now.